Hey, what's going on, everyone? Today's Facebook Live, I'm going to be talking about ADHD, autism, mood disorders, and other neurodevelopmental disorders, and how they're affected by a bacterial overgrowth in your small intestine, which can actually lead to increased inflammation within the brain. And that increased inflammation are some of the features and symptoms that we can see with those developmental problems. So it all starts with that bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine. We have actually two different kinds of bacteria. One is going to be up in your small intestine and one's going to be down in your large intestine. What happens a lot of the time is that bacteria that's supposed to be in the large intestine will actually creep up into the small intestine, and that's what I'm talking about, that overgrowth. That bacteria that should be down in that large intestine, but then it creeps up into that small intestine. And when that happens, you can get kind of like a leaky gut, and you can leak what are called lipopolysaccharides into the blood. And the reason that this is an issue is because then that affects what's called microglial function, which is something in the brain that actually is used for neural pruning. So this is going to sound weird, but your brain actually goes through a pruning process when you're born. When you're born, your brain has so many connections and so many neurons that you can't sustain that way. You actually have to start pruning off the neurons that you're not going to use. So it's really inefficient for your brain to keep all these neurons when you're born. So it goes through this pruning process where it kind of starts taking things down and only keeping the things that are useful and that you use. So the things that you don't use, you want to prune away, and so that your brain can work as efficiently as possible. So when microglial function is impaired because of this spilling over of the lipopolysaccharides, it's going to affect the ability for the brain to prune itself. So you're going to it's going to affect the pruning process, which is going to affect your brain's ability to develop the way that it should. Whether the bacterial overgrowth and the lipopolysaccharides happen at the time of birth or whether it happens later on in life, it's whenever that small intestine gets invaded by the large intestine bacteria that this problem starts to happen. So like I said, the first thing that happens is that large intestine bacteria gets into the small intestine bacteria. That creates a lipopolysaccharide spilling into the blood, which impairs your microglial and your brain, which then affects the neural pruning process, which is going to affect your kid's ability to develop their brain the way that they should. So the impairment of microglia may also be responsible for the abnormal white matter structure within the brain that seems to be associated with sensory issues. So that's also why a lot of these kids are going to have sensory issues. They're going to have hyposenses or hypersenses. A lot of the times they have hypersenses that are going to be really hypersensitive to sound and touch and taste and textures and things like that. The bacterial overgrowth, the leakage of those lipopolysaccharides, that prime microglia, and the increased inflammation all set the stage for this child not being able to handle additional stressors. So when a normal kid might be able to handle more physical or emotional things going on in their life, these kids are not going to be able to handle it because all these things are already stacked against them. So in our office, there's really two things that we're really concerned with any kid that has the neurodevelopmental, sensory, ADHD, autism type of thing going on. The first thing that we're going to want to do is correct that small intestine bacterial overgrowth. So the way that happens is we basically are going to separate out the small intestine from the large intestine bacteria and get those separate. And then only when that happens, we're able to kind of stop that feedback loop, that negative feedback loop, where we're going to stop that brain inflammation. And then the second thing that we want to do is correct the brain inflammation and something called the autonomic nerve system and get that brain out of that kind of gas pedal elevated mode. So just to recap, that imbalance in the intestinal bacteria along with the inflammation in the brain are responsible for the features associated with autism and ADHD and mood disorders and neurodevelopmental things. So that is what I have for you today. That is explaining how an overgrowth of bacteria in the small intestine is going to affect the brain and therefore affect the sensory issues and autism and ADHD, and that could definitely be contributing to your child's symptoms. So that is all I have for you tonight, and I will see you guys hopefully tomorrow on another Facebook Live.